Hello and welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share some Dogman encounters I came across on the internet. In regard to Dogman, we normally think of encounters and sightings as a more recent phenomenon, and I believe this because people are just now coming forward to share their stories on the internet because they have places where they know they won't be ridiculed. That is what I would like to create on this channel. There are more stories than ever out there now. But sightings of these creatures and cryptids in general aren't anything new or even recent. One story in this episode comes to us from the early 2000s, while one is from 1993. I've also heard of people seeing Dogman dating back even farther than this. And there are also ancient Egypt hieroglyphics depicting Anubis, who could very well be a Dogman from ancient times. I also want to announce that you can now become a member of this channel. You can click the join button below this video or click the link in the description. Alright, let's get to the stories. The first story of this episode comes from a poster who had several encounters with a Dogman. One encounter in particular was absolutely terrifying as the creature actually came into his house. He does not say exactly where he lived at the time, just that it was a very rural area and approximately 20 minutes from the closest town. The 10-mile radius surrounding his home was covered by forest. The original poster, or OP, lived on a 3-mile-long dirt road. To get to that road, you had to go down a paved road with a lot of very sharp curves. The OP was on his way home from work one night after midnight and was almost to the gravel road he lived on. He came around the last curve before reaching his road where a vineyard that had a house on the property sat. At the main entrance was a street light that lit up its immediate surroundings from dusk until dawn. He was on the curve when his bright lights illuminated the creature. It was walking out from behind the house and was right under the street light. It was approximately 20 to 30 feet from the road when he saw it, and it was heading directly for him. The OP could not stop staring at this creature in astonishment as it walked across the home's front yard. When it noticed him, it leaned forward and charged the car, running on 2 legs. As soon as the OP hit the straightaway after the sharp curve, this being slammed into the side of his car. He kept driving, looking out his window to see the Dogman running beside him, keeping up with him even though he was going about 50 miles an hour. He had almost 100 feet before the turn onto the gravel road that would lead him home. This is when he floored it and almost hit 70 before taking the turn. His car slid off the road as he did and up onto a hill before he was able to get control of the vehicle and bring it back down onto the road. There were 2 more streetlights where the gravel road met the paved one just past the vineyard. But after that is a long stretch of fields on either side of the road and darkness other than his headlights. After getting his car back onto the road, he was driving 50, but floored it again and got up to almost 90 miles an hour before he lost the creature. He turned off the road onto his driveway, flying up to his house before running inside, locking the doors and windows, then barricading himself in his bedroom. He would spend the next 3 nights at his girlfriend's house. One night later that week, it was again after midnight when the OP was laying in bed watching a movie before deciding to take a smoke break. Usually that late at night, instead of going outside, he will open his window, put a small fan in it, and blow the smoke outside. As he lit up his cigarette and blew his first puff of smoke out, he saw the Dogman sniffing around his car no more than 100 feet away. He started freaking out and yanked the fan out of the window before closing it. However, either the action or the smell of smoke caught the Dogman's attention because it turned and looked directly at him as he pulled down the shade. The OP immediately grabbed his gun and a samurai sword before barricading his bedroom door by pulling his dresser in front of it and wedging it firm against the door. He sunk into the corner of his room with all the lights and TV off. He then heard growling outside his window before the creature slammed into the side of his house beside it. After a long, nerve-wracking few minutes, He then heard something messing with the front door of his house, which is in the living room beside his bedroom, and the door was unlocked. He then heard the Dogman enter his house. It came to his bedroom door and he heard a low guttural growl and heavy breathing. It tried to open his bedroom door but couldn't. The being hit the door twice before slamming into it. It didn't hit the door again, but it did stand outside it, growling for half a minute before the OP once again heard his front door being forcefully opened. Everything went silent after that. He wasn't sure if the Dogman was trying to somehow trick him or lure him out, or waiting outside for him. He didn't leave his room until the next morning. When he did exit his room, still armed, he saw a hole in his bedroom door and found his front door ajar. The hole in his bedroom door was about 8 to 12 inches in diameter. Nothing else appeared to be damaged. He has seen the Dogman at a distance 2 more times since then, but both were during the day. The first time he looked out his dining room window to see it walking along the tree line on the other side of a very large field about 200 to 300 yards away. He quickly grabbed his binoculars to see what it was up to, but it was gone by the time he got back to his window. He tried to convince himself his eyes were just playing tricks on him. The last time he saw it was when he was driving the stretch of road with fields on either side. He looked off to see it walking along before disappearing into a dense part of the forest about 150 yards away. He again tried to convince himself it was just his eyes playing tricks on him. He mentions that the vineyard he drives by often has been bought and sold several times in the 1.5 to 2 years since he had his first encounter, when he saw this being emerge from behind the house on the vineyard's property. The last owner of the home had put up a big fence around the house and installed security cameras all over the place. He had since put the home up for sale. This makes the OP believe he had problems with the Dogman. First of all, I'd look into moving. Second, lock your front door. In all seriousness though, how terrifying would it be to have something like that come into your home? As big and strong as these creatures are said to be, I think it was toying with him and obviously trying to scare him. I say this because I don't think a dresser, no matter how well it's wedged against the door, could hold against a being like this. And instead of slamming against the house beside his window, why wouldn't it just break the window and come in that way if it wanted to hurt the OP or worse? Seems to me it just wanted to scare him. Both times it got angry when it noticed it had been seen. I wonder if that had anything to do with its aggressive responses. I've heard stories where these beings, as well as Sasquatch and others, do not like being seen. What do you think? The next story comes from a poster who prefaces his story by saying he had no idea what a Dogman was until he took to Reddit to post his story. Before discovering the name of the cryptid he encountered, he would search werewolf-like creature on the internet. That's when he found the story of an encounter from Niagara Falls, which is only about a half hour from where he lives in Ontario, Canada. The story he read was eerily similar to his own experience, which he says if he was alone during his encounter, he isn't sure he would have believed his own eyes. His story takes place on July 19th of 2016. He remembers this specific date because it was the same day as his family's annual Christmas in July celebration at his in-laws' house. There was also a full moon that night. He and his wife were on their way home taking back roads, which is very dark due to them living in a somewhat rural area. There was no traffic out because of the late hour. They were about 5 minutes from their home when the OP caught sight of something in his peripheral view near the forest on the passenger side of the car to his right. Whatever it was moving fast. He went to hit his brakes as his wife grabbed his leg. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the road. The creature also stopped directly in front of their car. He says just typing this next part gave him goosebumps. The bipedal cryptid looked at them and cocked its head. He and his wife asked each other, "Do you see that?" at the same time. He describes the creature as being about 7 feet tall with yellow eyes that glowed in his headlights. It was lean yet muscular, and the thing that stood out the most to him were this thing's legs. They were dog's legs, except this being was walking upright. It stood there glaring at them for only a moment before it took off and disappeared into the forest to his left. The only word that came to mind when they tried to describe it was werewolf. He and his wife both agreed that if they were alone, they aren't sure they would have believed what they saw. It's interesting to me that people use the term werewolf to describe these beings, but not unusual or surprising. It is the closest thing they can think of to describe what they see, as they have never heard of a dogman before. Another reason I find it interesting is because these creatures look just like how werewolves are depicted in movies. These obviously are based on old stories, tales, and folklore and/or mythology. So who's to say the werewolves we see in movies, books, and other types of media aren't actually based off dogmen? Maybe that's where the legends and lore come from, very early dogman sightings. It's just something that comes to mind when I see these cryptids described as werewolves. What do you think? The next story comes to us near Denmark, Wisconsin. Denmark is a village in Brown County and is located southeast of Green Bay. It began as a Danish settlement in 1848 and is referred to, along with Heartland, Wisconsin, as the nuclei of what developed into one of the most important regions of Danish immigration into the United States. As of the 2010 census, Denmark, Wisconsin has a population of 2,123. The original poster describes the land where his grandparents lived near Denmark as having a lot of farmland with patches of woods. He was 10 or 11 years old at the time of the encounter, which took place back in 2005 or 2006. His grandparents' land consisted of a few acres, with the far right corner of their property covered by a dense patch of woods that included a swamp. The woods and swamp extended a ways before butting up to another farm field. The OP was there standing on the back deck shooting cans with his BB gun. It was a hot, muggy July morning, and the entire time he was out there, he had an eerie feeling he couldn't get rid of. He felt like he was being watched. But when he stopped and looked around to see if anything was looking at him, he saw nothing. He would then return to shooting the cans, but the feeling would once again come over him. He scanned the tree line, and that's when he finally saw what was watching him. Standing there next to a tree was a massive creature. He went back when he was older to take a look at the tree and estimated this being to be 7 to 7.5 feet tall. He says the only comparison he can think of for this thing's body was Arnold Schwarzenegger. The creature had huge shoulders, arms, and chest. He says it's unreal just how big and muscular its features were. It had gray, shaggy fur that covered its shoulders and parts of its body. He says the head and face looked like that of a werewolf, with it having pointed ears and yellow eyes that seemed to glow even in the daylight. It had its mouth open and seemed to be snarling at him, but it almost seemed like it was smiling. The snarl or smile and the look on this thing's face was nothing short of pure evil. The OP says the only word he can use to describe it is sinister. He doesn't remember if it had a tail, but its legs looked human, except being bent like a dog's back legs. However, he was mostly focused on this thing's head and upper body. It stared at him for what felt like hours, but in reality was only about 10 seconds before it took off running through some very thick brush. It emerged farther down the tree line, then disappeared into the woods. He says the speed in which this creature covered the ground could not have been matched by a human. It ran about 50 to 60 yards in a matter of seconds. He was terrified by seeing this dogman and ran back into the house and stayed inside for the rest of the day. His aunt later told him that she heard some weird noises around the house the night before, but she hadn't told him because she didn't want to freak him out. He didn't tell her about his Dogman sighting because he thought she might think he was crazy or making it up. He insisted she tell him what she heard though. She described hearing a loud growling and snarling walking around the house and said it was unlike anything she had ever heard. He still visits his grandparents but hasn't seen anything since and hasn't heard about any other sightings in the area. He does say that there was a Sasquatch sighting down the road from their house back in the 60s or 70s. Again, we have another description where the original poster says the Dogman looked like a werewolf. They are also often described as being extremely muscular and having a body that resembles a bodybuilder. And this isn't the first time I've heard a story where it seems to snarl at someone in a sinister way, or someone hearing loud growling right outside their home, as the aunt described. Also, the speed in which these beings can move is amazing. To be able to cover hundreds of yards in a matter of seconds is incredible. What do you think about this experience? The next story comes to us from Michigan, which should be no surprise to anyone in a Dogman episode because Michigan seems to be a hotspot for this cryptid. It is also notorious for sightings of other types of cryptids as well, especially Sasquatch. The original poster only says that he lives in central Michigan, about 20 minutes north of Lansing. He was unfortunate enough to have 2 Dogman encounters. The first happened when he was on his way home from work at about 1:45 a.m. He was driving around 55 miles an hour when he saw something approximately 200 yards in front of him stand up on 2 legs in the ditch on the passenger side of his car. The creature took 3 or 4 running steps before it leapt about 6 to 7 feet in the air and completely cleared a 24-foot road from right to left. When it landed on the other side, it dropped down on all 4s and took off into the field to his left. The OP slowed down to try and get a better look at this thing, taking in just how big this creature was. It had black fur and it was extremely fast. It ran to a group of trees in the middle of a field and covered a distance of about 150 yards in a matter of seconds. That's when he lost sight of it. He says it had to have been about 8 feet tall because he could see the torso and head when it stood up in the ditch, which was about 3 to 4 feet deep. He isn't exactly sure what it was, but says by the look of the creature, it definitely fit the description of a Dogman. His next sighting would take place at a park near his home. He had just bought his first night vision monocular and took his girlfriend to the park to look at stars. It was about 8:30 when they got to the park. They powered up the monocular and started scanning the surrounding area while also checking out the sky. They did this for about 15 minutes before they saw a police officer pull into the park. The OP assumed he was there to ask them what they were doing, so he told his girlfriend to turn the flashlight on her phone on to signal him and show him they weren't trying to hide or that they weren't up to no good. The park they were in has a roundabout that begins at the entrance and circles around to the side exit. The officer pulled his vehicle, a Tahoe, around to the side exit before he stopped. Curious, the OP started watching him through his night vision monocular and saw something behind the vehicle. The officer must have seen it too because about that time he gunned it. The OP says he was about 100 yards away from where the officer's truck was, maybe a little more, and it was hard to make out the creature through his night vision monocular. But whatever it was, this thing was taller than the officer's Tahoe and it started chasing it. Then, as if it somehow knew it was being looked at, the creature squatted down onto his haunches and turned to lock eyes with the OP. He says its eyes were glowing and he could see what looked like a canine's head. However, he isn't 100% sure about that. He and his girlfriend took off running, but the creature did not chase them. It just sat there staring at them as they ran. This is what leads him to believe it was a Dogman and not something else. He goes on to say it squatted down like a human, but this thing was way too big to be a man. Since the sighting, he has wanted to ask the officer what he saw, but the officer did not stop to talk to them that night and the OP never sought him out. He says it was one of the weirdest and creepiest things he has ever experienced. I couldn't imagine having one Dogman encounter, but to have two? I guess that's just life in Michigan. Seriously though, Michigan seems to be Dogman central. I wonder what it is about the state that attracts them. We again have another description of a Dogman running at very high speeds, covering hundreds of yards in a matter of seconds, which matches up with other stories I've heard and read. This to me adds credence and believability to these stories. And for those of you who may be wondering what a monocular is, think binoculars but with one lens. What do you think of this man's two encounters? The final story of this episode comes to us from South Carolina way back in 1993. The original poster's encounter took place in a small town called Rembert. Rembert is located in central South Carolina and covers a total area of just 4.4 square miles. It has a population of just 306 people according to the 2010 census. The OP describes it as a very small, two-stoplight rural town. His encounter took place on March 8, 1993, when he was 13 years old. He remembers the date because it coincided with a full moon that garnered a lot of attention due to just how full and how bright it was that night. He was not the only one to see the Dogman that night either, as his stepfather, mother, and his sister all witnessed what he did. He and his family were on their way back home to Sumter, South Carolina from visiting family in Columbus. During their trip, they passed through Rembert just after getting off the highway. As they entered the small town, they saw an abandoned red car with all four doors open and no one inside, which brought them to an immediate stop. There was no one around the car and no one in sight. Their internal alarms were all going off at this point, and the OP, his mother, and his sister were all urging his stepfather not to stop for fear of this being a trap to rob unsuspecting passersby. His stepfather began slowly working his way around the stopped vehicle when the creature approached their car. The OP estimates that it was at least 10 feet tall. It reminded him of visiting New York City for the first time, where he had to turn his head and look straight up just to take in the sight of the skyscrapers in full view. The towering cryptid now standing beside their car was covered in jet black fur and was walking upright on its hind legs. It had very long, sharp claws and extremely sharp teeth, which were visible as it snarled at the OP and his family. But he says the most disturbing thing was the creature's glowing green eyes. He has never seen anything glow in his entire life like those eyes were glowing that night. The only thing that came to mind he could compare this thing to was a werewolf he had seen in horror movies. Except this thing was more realistic and more frightening. A living, breathing monster in the flesh, standing right beside his car. Even 28 years after the event, when he typed his story to post it, he still got chills thinking about this being. Now stopped due to this Dogman crossing the road in front of them, they sat in complete shock watching this creature walk around their vehicle while breathing heavily. In fact, the OP says it didn't seem interested in them at all and looked as if it was in some sort of trance as it disappeared into the cornfields on the opposite side of the road from where it came. His stepfather wasted no time and stomped on the gas pedal, taking off, speeding away from the scene. The whole encounter happened in the span of about 10 seconds. However, it felt like it was happening in slow motion to the OP. Over the years, they didn't speak much about their encounter, but when they did, they all agreed it was something not of this world. They were unsure if the full moon had anything to do with it, and he knows how cliche it sounds mentioning how werewolves come out during a full moon. He has not told a lot of people about his experience for fear of being called crazy or being accused of making it up due to it being outside of people's understanding and conflicting with their views and/or beliefs. His mother and sister have since passed away, but he does sometimes mention it to his stepfather because it has stuck with him all these years and still randomly pops into his head out of nowhere. He still wonders what happened to the people in the red car and thinks perhaps the creature had something to do with why they were nowhere to be seen that night. He does wonder if he and his family were the only ones to see this thing and doesn't remember any headlines or stories about it. He came across other stories online and wanted to share his encounter. It really is something how often the eyes are what stands out to the people who have these encounters with these cryptids, and how everything happens in a matter of seconds, but it feels like it is either happening in slow motion or taking much longer to transpire than it actually does. These are small details from the stories I hear and read about from all over the world that not only add credence to these tales, but make me believe them. It would be too much of a coincidence to find the same details in all of these stories from thousands of people from all over the world. What a terrifying experience that would have been, not just to see the Dogman, but for them to see an abandoned car at the scene too. It makes you wonder what happened to whoever was inside. By the sound of the story though, it doesn't sound like anything good. What do you think? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.